There's a moment, it lasts maybe 2 seconds, where you see something that doesn't fit. A smile that's too steady, eyes that don't move when they should. Cole Bennett had learned to trust that moment. It had kept him alive in places most people couldn't find on a map. But this wasn't a combat zone. This was a Tuesday evening, a $60 entree, and a restaurant full of people who thought the most dangerous thing in the room was the wine list. He was wrong to think the same, because across a frosted glass partition, inside a private dining room lit like a stage, a woman was surrounded, and she was the only one at the table who understood exactly what was happening to her. If you're watching this for the first time, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now, tap the like, and drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. People are watching from places I never expected, and every comment reminds me why I keep telling these stories. Don't skip ahead. Don't walk away. Because what starts with a folded napkin is about to take you somewhere you won't see coming. The reservation had been for 7:30. By 7:15, Cole Bennett was already seated at a corner table near the back of Hargrove's, the kind of restaurant where the menus had no prices and the servers introduced themselves with last names. He'd chosen the corner out of habit, the way he always chose corners, always chose seats facing the door, always noted the exits before he noted anything else. Some habits didn't retire just because the man did. He wasn't supposed to be here. The meeting with Douglas Fenn, a mid-level compliance officer at a regional investment firm who'd been feeding Cole information about a suspicious wire transfer pattern for 3 weeks, had dissolved 2 hours earlier via a 4-word text message. Can't do it. Sorry. No explanation. No reschedule. Just gone, the way informants went when someone above them applied the right kind of pressure. Cole had already driven 40 minutes through Atlanta traffic. He'd parked. He'd put on the gray blazer he kept on the back seat for exactly these situations. So he'd walked in anyway, because the salmon here was good, and because eating a real dinner at a proper table was something he tried to give himself at least once a week. His daughter Mia was at her friend Kayla's house until 9. He had time. He ordered water. He studied the menu without reading it. The restaurant moved around him, couples leaning into each other across candlelight, a birthday table somewhere to his left, making the kind of noise that people apologized for afterward. 2 men in dark suits near the front who were clearly expensing whatever they ordered. Ordinary Tuesday evening machinery. Cole tracked it without meaning to, the way a former athlete tracks the geometry of a room even when they've told themselves they're retired. It was the frosted glass partition that caught him. Hargrove's had a private dining room, separated from the main floor by a panel of etched glass that was transparent enough to suggest exclusivity without providing actual privacy. From Cole's corner table, at the right angle, you could see shapes, movement, the suggestion of a gathering. He hadn't paid it any attention when he sat down. He paid attention now. There were 4 people inside, 3 men, 1 woman. The men were arranged in a way that looked like a dinner but functioned like something else. 2 on one side of the table, 1 at the head, the woman seated across from them in a position that left no comfortable way out. The body language was the thing. The men were relaxed in that specific, deliberate way that people perform when they need someone else to believe they have all the time in the world. The woman was not relaxed. She was composed, which was different. Composed was what you defaulted to when you couldn't afford to show what you were actually feeling. Cole watched her for maybe 90 seconds. She was somewhere around 30, dark hair pulled back in a way that looked professional, but was probably the result of a very long day. Dressed for a board meeting, not a dinner. Her posture was straight, but the straightness cost her something. He could see it in the set of her jaw, the way her hands stayed visible on the table rather than in her lap, the micro-adjustments she kept making with her shoulders like someone bracing for impact. She hadn't touched her food. None of them had touched the food. In front of her sat a document, several pages, paper-clipped, and a pen that nobody had handed her but that had clearly been placed within her reach on purpose. One of the men said something. She responded. Whatever she said, none of them liked it. Not overtly, but Cole caught the shift. The man at the head of the table leaned back in his chair with the kind of deliberate patience that was really a threat. Cole looked away, picked up the water glass, thought about the salmon. Not your business. That was the rule he'd made for himself 18 months ago after a freelance security assessment had turned into a 3-week ordeal involving a forged export license, a very angry shipping company, and a bruised rib that took 6 weeks to stop reminding him it existed. He had a 9-year-old daughter at home. He had a mortgage on an office that was too small, and rent on an apartment that was too large, and a reputation that was finally, slowly, starting to rebuild itself. He had enough. He looked back at the private room. The woman was looking directly at him. Not the way people accidentally make eye contact through glass, deliberately. She had found the one angle through the frosted partition, and she had found his face on the other side of it, and she was looking at him with an expression that was carefully, professionally neutral in a way that would have fooled almost anyone. Cole Bennett was not almost anyone. He'd spent 4 years reading people in environments where reading them wrong got people killed. He knew the difference between someone catching your eye and someone reaching for you. She dropped her gaze, picked up her napkin. The movement was natural. She brought it to her lips like she was dabbing, polite table manners, nothing unusual. And then she set it down beside her plate and returned her attention to the man speaking across from her. Cole's server appeared at his elbow. "Ready to order, sir?" "Give me another minute." He waited until the server moved away. Then he looked at the napkin. She'd set it down folded, near the edge of the table closest to the partition. From his angle, he could just barely see it. One word, written in what looked like eyeliner, the letters small and pressed hard into the cloth. "Help." Cole put the menu down. He sat with it for a moment, sat with the weight of that single word and what it meant to answer it and what it would cost him and what it would cost Mia if he made a decision tonight that he couldn't walk back from. The calculus happened fast, the way it always had, variables stacking against each other, risk assessment, exit options, probability of misreading the situation. The man at the head of the table slid the document closer to the woman. Cole stood up. He buttoned his blazer, the gray one, the one he kept for meetings, the one that made him look like someone who belonged in rooms like that. And he picked up his water glass, and he walked around the partition, and he pushed open the door to the private dining room like it was something he did every Tuesday. All 4 of them looked at him. "Sorry I'm late," Cole said. He pulled out the empty chair beside the woman and sat down in it. Traffic on Peachtree was a disaster. The silence had texture. The man at the head of the table, mid-50s, silver hair, the kind of tan you got from a boat and not a yard, recovered first. His name, Cole would learn later, was Richard Platt. He had the practiced ease of a man who hadn't been surprised in a professional setting in 20 years. "I'm sorry," Platt said, his voice carrying the specific warmth of someone accustomed to using warmth as an instrument. "And you are?" "He's with me," the woman said. Her voice was steadier than Cole expected. He glanced at her sideways. Up close she looked tired in a specific way. Not physically, but in the way of someone who had been managing something enormous alone for too long, and had just, in the last 30 seconds, decided to stop managing it alone. "I don't believe we've been introduced," Platt said. "Cole." He offered his hand across the table to Platt, then to each of the other 2 men in turn, both of whom shook it with varying degrees of reluctance. "I handle advisory work for Victoria. I apologize for missing the start of the evening." He picked up the menu that was sitting unused near the empty place setting, opened it casually. "Have you ordered?" The third man, younger, late 30s, a carefully tailored jacket that was doing a lot of work, leaned forward. "This was a private dinner." "It was a dinner," Cole said. He set the menu down and looked at the document still sitting in front of Victoria. "And that looks like a contract, so I'm guessing it was also more than a dinner, which is usually when Victoria likes to have someone from the advisory side present." He looked at Platt. "I'm sure you understand." Platt's expression didn't change. That was the tell. A man who had expected an uninterrupted evening and was now running calculations about how to proceed with an unexpected variable in the room. Cole had seen that look before. He'd seen it across tables in situations considerably more dangerous than this one, and the one thing he'd learned was that men who ran on control didn't like admitting they'd lost the thread of it. "Victoria," Platt said, redirecting, "we were in the middle of a fairly time-sensitive discussion." "Then we should keep moving," Cole said, before Victoria could respond. He reached forward and picked up the document, the casual confidence of someone entitled to touch it, and began to read. He gave it 10 seconds. That was all he needed. He'd been reading financial documents for 11 years, fraudulent ones for 6. The structure was wrong in 3 places he could identify before he'd finished the first page. A clause on page 2 that was standard language from a merger agreement, but had been grafted here out of context. A reference to an audit report dated 11 months earlier that didn't exist in any of the financial records he'd seen in publicly available filings, and a liability indemnification section so broad that signing it would have meant Victoria was not just agreeing to step down, but actively waiving her right to contest the circumstances under which she was doing so. It was professional work. It would have fooled most people. It would have especially fooled someone under pressure, surrounded, with their phone taken, believing the best-case scenario was to sign and leave. Cole set this document down. "Where's the Q3 audit report?" he said. Platt blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "This document references an audit report from Q3 of last year, Ashford Global's external audit. Page 2, footnote 4. Cole tapped the paper. "I'd like to see it before we go any further because the figures in footnote 4 don't match anything I've seen from Whitmore Partners, which I'm pretty sure handled the audit that year. So either I'm looking at an older document than I thought, or there's a sourcing issue we need to talk about." The room was quiet. The younger man, Cole still didn't have his name, glanced at Platt. The second executive, heavy-set, who had not said a word since Cole walked in, shifted in his chair. Platt smiled. It was an extraordinary smile, actually, entirely unchanged from the smile he'd been wearing before Cole arrived, which was either genuine confidence or a very sophisticated performance. "I don't think this is the appropriate venue for a document review." "Probably not," Cole agreed. "I also don't think this is the appropriate venue for a board-level restructuring, which is what this document is. But here we are." He looked at Victoria. "Do you want to continue?" She looked back at him. There was something moving behind her eyes, a recalibration happening in real time. A woman who had walked into this room expecting to fight alone and was now revising that assessment on insufficient information about who exactly she'd just let into her corner. "No," she said. "I don't think tonight works." Platt's smile stayed exactly where it was. "Victoria, the timeline on this, the timeline can wait for a venue with documentation." Cole stood, and Victoria stood with him. The kind of move that only works if you do it without hesitation, and neither of them hesitated. He picked up the document and held it. "I'll need to take this for review." "That document is company property," the younger man said, and there was an edge in it now. The first honest thing anyone at the table had said in Cole's presence. "Then have your legal team send a formal request for its return." Cole tucked it under his arm. "I'm sure Victoria's legal team will respond promptly." He held the door. Victoria walked through it without looking back. They crossed the main floor of Hargrove's at a pace that was fast enough to be purposeful and slow enough not to be alarming, and Cole kept his hand loosely at the small of her back, not holding, just the suggestion of guidance. And they went through the front entrance and out into the Atlanta night air, which was still warm even at 8 o'clock, and they walked 20 feet from the door before Victoria stopped. She turned to face him. In the light from the restaurant's exterior fixtures, he could see her properly for the first time. She was younger than he'd initially thought, or maybe just looked at now that the calculated composure had cracked slightly around the edges. Her eyes were dark and direct, and currently doing about 4 different things at once. "I don't know who you are," she said. "Cole Bennett." He offered his hand again. She looked at it differently this time. "You're not my advisor." "No." "You just walked in there and you wrote help on a napkin." She stopped. Something moved across her face. Not gratitude exactly. Something more complicated than that. Something that had to do with the particular indignity of needing to be rescued and the further indignity of having it witnessed. "I didn't know if anyone would see it." "I saw it." A cab rolled past on the street. Somewhere a block over, someone honked twice. The ordinary city moved around them, indifferent to the fact that 20 minutes ago Victoria Ashford had been sitting inside a room where 3 men were methodically dismantling the company she had spent a decade building, and the only thing that had interrupted it was a word written in eyeliner on a dinner napkin. "That document," she said. "You saw something in it." "I saw several things." "What kind of advisor are you, actually?" "Financial investigator. I look at fraud." The word landed between them, and Cole watched her face as it landed. Watched her absorb the specific weight of that word in relation to the evening she'd just survived, in relation to men she'd trusted for years who'd been smiling at her across a dinner table while engineering her removal from her own company. "The audit report you mentioned," she said carefully, "the one that doesn't match." Doesn't exist, Cole said, as far as I can tell from public records, which means someone manufactured it. She was quiet for a long moment. A woman running a company that employed 3,000 people, making a fast assessment of a stranger in a gray blazer who had walked into a room uninvited and who was now standing on a public sidewalk telling her that her company's financial records had been forged. How long have you been investigating financial fraud? She finally said. 11 years? And before that? Cole looked at her evenly. Before that, I did something else. She studied him. Whatever she found in his face, or didn't find, apparently satisfied whatever calculation she was running. I need to understand what I'm dealing with, she said. Tonight. I need to understand all of it tonight. I know, he said. She pulled out her phone, the one they'd apparently returned to her when she left the private room, or perhaps she'd kept it on her somewhere they hadn't found, and looked at it, then looked back at him. You said the document references a forged audit. If that's true, someone inside my company built this. Someone who had access to our internal financial structure. Yes. Which means the problem is older than tonight. Probably a lot older, Cole said. Victoria Ashford looked at the restaurant behind them. The warm light in the windows, the shapes of people inside having ordinary Tuesday dinners. And somewhere behind the frosted glass partition, 3 men who were, right now, recalibrating their next move. Then she looked back at Cole. I'm not going home tonight, she said. I wouldn't recommend it. Where do you work out of? Office on Clement Street. It's not fancy. I don't need fancy. I need someone who knows what they're looking at. She held out her hand. Do you have a card? He gave her one. She looked at it, looked at him. I'll need access to everything, Cole said. If you're serious about this. Financial records, personnel files, vendor contracts, everything you can get me without triggering an alert inside the company. I can get you access to what I have remotely. She was already moving, already thinking 3 steps forward, and Cole had the first real sense of who she actually was. Not the composed woman performing stillness under pressure in that private room, but the person underneath it, the one who had built a billion-dollar company from the ground up and hadn't done it by waiting for situations to clarify themselves. My CFO has a secondary archive that bypasses the main server. I've never had reason to use it before. Use it tonight. She nodded once, the kind of nod that closed a decision rather than opened one. She started walking toward the parking structure across the street, then stopped and turned back. You could have kept eating your dinner, she said. Cole thought about that for a moment, about the salmon he hadn't ordered, about Mia at her friend's house, not expecting him until 9, about the rule he'd made for himself 18 months ago, and how long rules lasted when a woman wrote a single word on a napkin and looked at you through frosted glass like you were the only solid thing in the room. Yeah, he said, I could have. She turned and kept walking. Cole stood on the sidewalk for a second longer, the stolen document still tucked under his arm, and then he followed her. Because whatever had started in that room tonight was not finished, and because the audit report that didn't exist was attached to a financial structure he had seen before, somewhere, in a form he couldn't quite place yet, but that had left a mark on him he'd carried for 6 years. He just didn't know that yet. He would by morning. Cole's office on Clement Street occupied the second floor of a building that had been a print shop in a previous life, and still smelled faintly of ink and machine oil, despite the fact that the print shop had closed 11 years ago. The landlord had painted over the walls twice and replaced the flooring once, but some smells were structural. Cole had stopped noticing it after the first month. Mia called it the old paper smell, and said she liked it, which was the kind of thing a 9-year-old said that you held on to for longer than you expected. Victoria noticed it when she walked in. She didn't say anything about it, just took in the space the way she probably took in every space, quickly, cataloging, filing. 2 desks, one of which Cole actually used and one of which held a printer and 3 stacked boxes of documents from a case he'd closed in February. A whiteboard along the left wall covered in faded marker from something he hadn't erased yet. A window facing the street that let in enough light during the day to make the office feel larger than it was, and at 9:30 at night let in the glow of the parking garage across the street, and not much else. You can use the second desk, Cole said, moving the top box of documents to the floor. Victoria set her bag down and opened her laptop without responding. She was already somewhere else in her head. He could see it, the way she'd gone internal the moment they left the restaurant, processing, restructuring, running the kind of calculations that CEOs ran when the variable that had changed was the one that changed everything else. Cole called Kayla's mother, Linda Ostrowski, who had 3 kids of her own and an extraordinary tolerance for last-minute schedule changes, and explained that a work situation had come up and asked if Mia could stay the night. Linda said, "Of course, no problem." Mia was already asleep anyway. He thanked her. He hung up and stood at his desk for a moment before he sat down, aware of a specific feeling he hadn't felt in a while, the weight of something that was going to take all night and probably longer. He made coffee. Not the good kind. The office coffee maker produced something that tasted like it had been filtered through ambition rather than paper, but it was hot and it had caffeine. He poured a cup for Victoria without asking and set it on the corner of the second desk. She picked it up without looking at it, drank, kept reading whatever she'd pulled up on her screen. "The secondary archive," Cole said, sitting down. "Can you access it from here?" "Already in." She turned the laptop to show him. "Marcus, my CFO, set it up 3 years ago after a server breach scare. It mirrors everything from the main financial system but runs on a separate login with different credentials. Nobody else knows the credentials except Marcus and me." "Marcus know you're accessing it tonight?" "Marcus is in Singapore at a conference." She paused. "Which I'm now wondering about." Cole looked at her. "You think he's involved?" "I don't know what I think." She said it flatly, without drama, which somehow made it worse. The particular flatness of someone articulating, for the first time out loud, that the people they'd built something with might have been working against them the entire time. 2 hours ago, I would have said Marcus was the one person in that company I trusted completely. And now? Now I'm wondering how 3 executives managed to get their hands on financial data detailed enough to construct that document without someone from the inside helping them. Cole nodded slowly. He pulled up the document on his own laptop. He'd photographed every page in the parking garage before they left, because keeping the physical copy was a risk, and having a digital record of it was not optional. He started from the beginning again, slower this time, reading not just for what was in it, but for what it implied about where the information had come from. It took him about 12 minutes to find the first real thread. "The vendor list on page 7, he said. "Do you recognize these names? Meridian Supply Group, Northbridge Consulting, Caltech Infrastructure Partners." Victoria leaned over and looked. Something shifted in her expression. "Meridian and Northbridge are existing vendors. We've used both for years. Caltech—" She stopped. "Caltech. I approved a contract with Caltech 14 months ago. Infrastructure consulting for our Nashville facility expansion. It was a standard procurement process, competitive bids, legal reviewed the contract." She looked at Cole. "Why?" "Because Caltech Infrastructure Partners doesn't have a physical address that traces to an actual office. I ran a quick check in the car." He turned his screen toward her. He'd searched the name during the drive over, and what had come back was a registered LLC in Delaware with a formation date of 22 months ago, a registered agent that was a law firm, and no discoverable web presence beyond a basic filing page. "That's a shell." The words sat between them. Victoria pulled her laptop back toward her and typed. Cole watched her pull up internal records, vendor files, the procurement documents for the Nashville contract, payment histories. Her movements were quick and precise, someone who knew their own systems well, and then her hand stilled on the keyboard. "We've paid Caltech 4 installments," she said. 14 months of consulting retainer. She named a figure. It was not a small figure. "Who approved the payments?" "Each one would have gone through accounts payable, flagged for department head approval, then signed off at the CFO level." She paused. "Marcus signed off on all 4. The room was quiet except for the hum of Cole's computer and the occasional sound of a car moving through the street below. Victoria stared at the payment records on her screen in the specific way of someone who was revising a significant portion of their understanding of the last 14 months. Cole got up and went to the whiteboard. He erased what was already on it and wrote Caltech at the top, drew a box around it, then connected it with a line to a second box where he wrote Meridian. He stood back. "I need access to your full vendor list," he said. "Everything going back 5 years. I can pull it. And your accounts payable records, monthly, not quarterly summaries. I want to see individual transactions." She started pulling files. Cole went back to his desk and opened a second window, pulling up a corporate registry database. He paid a monthly subscription for that. Most people didn't know existed. He ran Caltech Infrastructure Partners through it first, then started searching for related entities. Same registered agent, same formation date range, similar naming conventions. He found two more in the first 10 minutes. Meridian Supply Group was legitimate, 30 years in business, real offices in Charlotte, publicly traded parent company. But nestled in the accounts payable records that Victoria was now feeding him, there was a second Meridian entry. Meridian Supply Group LLC, not Meridian Supply Group Inc. Different entity. Same name, close enough that you'd have to be looking carefully to separate them. The LLC had been formed 17 months ago. Stop, Cole said. Victoria looked up. How many vendors in your system have Meridian in the name? She checked. 2. We have Meridian Supply Group and... She saw it. Meridian Supply Group LLC. Same vendor code? No, different codes. They're listed as separate vendors. She pulled up both payment histories and set her laptop so Cole could see both screens at once. The legitimate Meridian had a payment history going back 9 years. Regular, consistent, normal amounts for the services described. The LLC had appeared 18 months ago. Its payments were larger, irregularly spaced, and the service descriptions were vague in the way that vague service descriptions were always vague when someone needed them to be. Cole started writing on the whiteboard. It went like that for the next 2 hours. Victoria pulled records and Cole read them, and every time he found something he wrote it on the whiteboard and connected it to the other things he'd found. And the picture that assembled itself across the whiteboard was not a simple one. It was layered, careful, the kind of financial architecture that took time to build and took someone with detailed knowledge of the company's internal structure to build correctly. Ghost vendors embedded alongside real ones. Payment amounts calibrated to stay just below automatic audit thresholds. Service descriptions that referenced real projects, but billed for work that either hadn't been done or had been done by someone else and billed again. At 11:40, Victoria stood up and walked to the window. She stood there with her arms crossed, looking out at the parking garage, and Cole gave her a minute because he could tell she needed one. How much? She said without turning around. Cole looked at his running total. He gave her the number. She was quiet. That's not all of it, he said. That's what I can account for from what you've pulled tonight. There's likely more in the vendor categories I haven't gone through yet. How long has this been running? Based on the formation dates on the shell entities and the earliest irregular payments I can trace, at least 3 years, maybe closer to 4. Victoria turned from the window. She looked at the whiteboard, all of it, the names and boxes and connecting lines, and the running total Cole had written in the bottom right corner. She looked at it for a long time. That document tonight, she said, the one they wanted me to sign, the fake audit it referenced, the $400 million shortfall. The shortfall doesn't exist, Cole said. I know, but if I'd signed, I would have been legally certifying that it did. I would have been acknowledging that the company had a financial crisis I'd mismanaged. She said it evenly, without inflection, laying it out like a problem in logic. And then the board would have had grounds to remove me, legitimate grounds, on paper, because I'd certified it myself. Yes. And while the investigation into the fake shortfall was running, nobody would have been looking at the real money, the real theft. Right. She sat back down. She picked up the coffee cup, found it empty, set it down again. This wasn't put together in the last few weeks. No, Cole said. This took years. Which means someone decided years ago that this was the plan, that they were going to take my company, and they spent years inside it, setting it up, and the whole time they were... She stopped herself, looked at the table, looked back up. Who is Richard Platt to you? You recognized him. In the restaurant, when you shook his hand, there was something. Cole had been waiting for this, or something like it. He'd known it would come up, had been deciding since the parking garage how much to say and when. He got up and refilled both their coffee cups, sat back down. Platt runs a private equity advisory firm called Harland Group, he said. They operate mostly out of Chicago, but they have Atlanta clients. I came across them 6 years ago during an investigation I was running. What kind of investigation? Similar pattern to this one. Ghost vendors, shell companies, fraudulent financial reporting designed to tank a target company's apparent value before a forced acquisition. The company was a mid-sized logistics firm called Crenshaw Distribution. They had about $200 million in revenue, solid fundamentals, a controlling family that wanted to keep it private. He stopped. Victoria was watching him. What happened? The investigation fell apart. The evidence I'd assembled, and I had good evidence, the same kind of pattern we're looking at right now, was challenged by Harlan Group's legal team as procedurally compromised. They found a technical issue in how I'd obtained access to certain financial records, and they used it to have the core of the investigation set aside. He said it without apparent emotion, the way you said things that had had enough time to calcify into plain fact. Crenshaw Distribution was acquired by a Harlan affiliate 14 months later at a price that was roughly 40% of what it should have been. The family lost most of what they'd built. And your investigation was officially closed as inconclusive, which is a polite way of saying it died. He looked at the whiteboard. I spent about a year afterward trying to find another angle in. Then I decided that was probably enough of that, and I moved on. Victoria absorbed this. But the blueprint is the same. The blueprint is identical. Same shell company structure, same vendor doubling strategy, same use of forged audit documentation to manufacture a financial crisis. He looked at her. I've been sitting here for the last hour wondering whether Harlan Group moved on from Crenshaw to other targets in the years between then and now, or whether your company was always the actual target and Crenshaw was something else, practice, or a funding mechanism, or both. Ashford Global is a lot bigger than a $200 million logistics company. Yes. She understood what he meant, the scale of what they were looking at tonight, the sophistication of the operation, the years of patient groundwork, wasn't proportionate to the kind of takeover attempt that happened because someone saw an opportunity. It was proportionate to something that had been planned from the beginning with a specific destination in mind. Tell me about the executives in that room tonight, Cole said. The two men with Platt. Victoria leaned back in her chair. She looked like she hadn't slept in longer than today. There were specific kinds of exhaustion that had nothing to do with hours and everything to do with accumulated weight, and Victoria had been carrying something for a while. Derek Cho. He's been our chief operations officer for 4 years. I hired him myself out of a firm in Boston. Excellent operational record, strong references. She paused. He's the one who brought the Caltech contract to my attention, actually. He recommended them for the Nashville project. Cole wrote Derek Cho on the whiteboard. And the third man? Heavy set, didn't say anything. Warren Bales, general counsel. He's been with the company since before I took over as CEO, so 7 years minimum. She said it with something careful in her voice, the something that came from realizing that longevity wasn't the same as loyalty. Warren reviewed the Caltech contract. He signed off on it. CHO and Bales connected on the whiteboard to Caltech and to Meridian LLC and to the running total in the corner. Cole sat back down. He looked at the board. He looked at the time, nearly 1 in the morning, and then at Victoria, who was looking at the board with the expression of someone doing the specific math of how much they hadn't known for how many years. I need to ask you something directly, Cole said. She looked at him. Marcus Hale, your CFO. He signed off on every ghost vendor payment in this file. There are 2 possibilities. Either he's part of this, or someone is using his credentials without his knowledge. Or both, Victoria said quietly. He could have been compromised and not known how it was being used. Possible. Less likely than the other 2, but possible. Cole looked at her. Do you have a way to reach him in Singapore that isn't a company line? She thought about it. His personal cell. We text sometimes. Personal things, nothing work-related. Text him tonight. Don't mention any of this. Just something normal. See how he responds. She looked at him for a moment, then pulled out her phone and typed something. They both looked at the screen for a few seconds before she set it face down on the desk. It'll be morning there, she said. He might not see it until he wakes up. That's fine. Cole turned back to the records on his laptop. I want to look at the financial reporting structure. The way the fraudulent figures in that document were built, someone would have needed access to the company's internal modeling, not just the final numbers, but the methodology, the way you build your projections. That access exists in maybe 4 people in the company. Name them. She did. Cole wrote them down. 2 names he didn't recognize. One was Marcus Hale, and the 4th was Derek Cho. There was a particular silence that happened when a picture became undeniable. Not the silence of shock, but the silence of a mind finally accepting a thing it had been resisting. Cole had sat in that silence with clients before, and he recognized it, and he let it be. "I built that company," Victoria said, not bitterly, just as a statement of plain fact. "I took over at 26 with a company that was bleeding cash and a board that spent the first 18 months waiting for me to fail. I restructured the debt, renegotiated the vendor contracts, moved us into 3 new market verticals over 4 years. I turned it into something." She stopped. "And this whole time, while I was doing that, while you were making it worth taking," Cole said. She looked at him. "That's not a criticism," he said. "It's the thing Harland Group counted on. A struggling company isn't worth a 6-year operation. They needed you to build it first." The way her face moved when he said that was complicated. Anger and something almost like dark recognition, the specific feeling of understanding exactly how you'd been used. She didn't say anything for a moment. "So what do we do?" she said. Cole looked at the whiteboard. They had enough to understand the structure. They didn't yet have enough to prove it in a room full of hostile people, which was where they were going to need to prove it, because Platt and Cho and Bales weren't going to stop because one dinner didn't go as planned. By tomorrow morning, they would be running contingency plans. By tomorrow afternoon, if Cole and Victoria didn't have something solid, this was going to move to the next stage. "We need the metadata," Cole said. "Those forged documents in the report, the audit that doesn't exist. Whoever built them left traces. File creation dates, software signatures, document properties. I know a forensic accountant who can pull that kind of analysis in 12 hours if we can get her the files. Can you reach her tonight?" "I can reach her." He picked up his phone, thought about the hour, texted anyway. Janet Reyes would be annoyed. Janet Reyes was always annoyed when Cole called outside business hours, and she always answered anyway. Victoria looked at the whiteboard again, at all of it. "You've been carrying this, the Crenshaw case, for 6 years. Cole didn't answer immediately. He looked at the board too. At the connecting lines between boxes, the same architecture he'd mapped 6 years ago in a different office on a different whiteboard, the same handwriting laying out the same bones of the same predatory machine. "It wasn't about carrying it," he said. "I knew what I'd seen. I knew the investigation was right. When something like that gets shut down through legal maneuvering rather than because the evidence was wrong, so you don't forget what you know. You just can't do anything with it." He looked at her. "Until the same thing shows up in front of you again." Victoria's phone lit up on the desk. They both looked at it. A text from Marcus Hale. She'd messaged him something innocuous about a mutual contact's birthday, and he'd responded in 3 words. Already sent something. Normal. Casual. The response of a man, asleep in a Singapore hotel, who had no idea his name was written on a whiteboard in Atlanta being connected to a financial fraud operation. Or the response of a man who was very good at this. Victoria set the phone down. She looked at Cole. "You said the forensic accountant needs the files. The actual document files from tonight." "The document itself is a photocopy, but the original would have been created digitally. If we can get the source files, the original audit report they fabricated, the financial models they used to build the fake shortfall figures, Janet can take them apart. Those files would be on company servers." "Yes." "Which I technically still have administrative access to." She looked at her laptop. "Until they figure out that tonight didn't work and move to pull my access credentials, which..." She checked the time. "Marcus is the one who would authorize an access change. If he's not involved, he won't do it without talking to me first. If he is involved, he'll need to be careful about timing because doing it right now would look suspicious." She thought for a second. "I probably have until morning." "Then let's not waste it," Cole said. She turned back to her laptop. Cole moved his chair to the second desk so they were working side by side instead of across from each other. And that small change, the shift from a transaction between a client and an investigator to 2 people leaning over the same problem together, was something neither of them commented on, but both of them noticed. Outside, Atlanta moved through its late-night rhythms. The parking garage across the street had gone mostly quiet. A siren somewhere, then gone. The coffee had gone cold again. They kept working. By 2 in the morning, they had found 9 shell vendor entities embedded across 5 years of Ashford Global's accounts payable records. By 3, Cole had constructed a financial map detailed enough that the total stolen from the company was no longer an estimate. It was a number, specific and documented, and the number was significant enough that what had happened here was not just a hostile takeover attempt. It was organized financial crime, running across multiple corporate entities, with enough scale that the people behind it had believed, correctly, that the complexity of it was its own best protection. They had also found, buried in a procurement subfolder that hadn't been touched in 4 years, a document that made Cole stop entirely. It was a vendor evaluation report, routine-looking, standard format, but the consultant firm listed as the author was a name Cole recognized in the way you recognize something that had been a wound. Harland Advisory Partners, a subsidiary of Harland Group, a name that had appeared in the Crenshaw investigation 6 years ago and that had no business being inside a document folder at Ashford Global 4 years ago, unless someone at Ashford Global had been in contact with Harland Group 4 years ago, which was a year before Derek Cho joined the company. Cole looked at the document properties. The file had been created, modified, and last accessed in a sequence that told a clear story if you knew what you were reading. "Victoria," he said. She was reading something else and looked up. He turned his screen toward her. He watched her read it, watched her read it again. "That's 4 years ago," she said. "Yes." "Before Cho came on board?" "Yes." She looked at him, and in her face was the specific expression of someone who had just located the actual beginning of a thing they'd thought they understood. Not where it appeared to start, but where it actually started, back further than they'd looked, in a corner they hadn't examined. The moment when a bad situation revealed itself to be worse than estimated, not because new damage had been done, but because the original damage was older than it had seemed. "Someone was already inside my company 4 years ago," she said. "Or working toward it," Cole said. "Building access." She sat with that for a moment. Then she said something that Cole would think about later, not because it was unexpected, but because of how steady her voice was when she said it. "I need to beat them at their own game. Inside that boardroom, on the record." She looked at him. "Can we build something in the next few hours that holds up in a room full of hostile people?" Cole looked at the whiteboard, at the 9 boxes and the connecting lines, and the 6-year thread that ran from a logistics company in a closed investigation to this office on Clement Street at 3 in the morning. "We can build something," he said. Janet Reyes arrived at Cole's office at 6:40 in the morning, carrying a laptop bag on one shoulder, a paper cup of gas station coffee in her hand, and the specific expression of a woman who had been doing favors for Cole Bennett long enough to have developed strong opinions about it. She was 51, short, with reading glasses she kept on top of her head, and pulled down roughly 12 times an hour. She had spent 17 years as a forensic accountant for the SEC before deciding that the government moved too slowly for her temperament and going private. She was the best Cole knew at what she did, which was the only reason he'd texted her at 1 in the morning, and she was here, which was the only reason he didn't feel worse about it. She looked at the whiteboard. She looked at Victoria. She looked at Cole. "You look terrible," she said to Cole. "I haven't slept." "I can see that." She set her bag down, pulled her glasses off the top of her head and onto her face, and stepped up to the whiteboard. She read for about 40 seconds, which was longer than most people needed and shorter than you'd expect given how much was on it. 9 entities. 9 confirmed, possibly more in vendor categories we haven't finished. Over 5 years. At minimum. She turned to Victoria. "You're the CEO." "Yes." "Did you know any of this was happening?" Victoria looked at her steadily. "No." Janet made a sound that wasn't quite skeptical and wasn't quite accepting, just the sound of someone filing an answer to be evaluated later against the evidence. "And you got into the source files?" "I pulled everything I still had administrative access to," Victoria said. "File packages, the original document they brought to the dinner, the procurement records going back 4 years. It's all on the shared drive Cole set up." Janet sat down at the second desk and opened her laptop. "All right," she said, "give me the files." While Janet worked, Cole stood at the window and drank the last of the coffee, which had been bad hours ago and had since moved into a category beyond description. The sun was coming up over the building across the street, the specific pale gray of an Atlanta morning that hadn't decided yet whether it was going to be clear or overcast. And the city was starting its early sounds, the first buses, the distant construction on the block they'd been working on for 8 months. Victoria was at the second desk on her own laptop, going through vendor documentation she hadn't finished the night before. She'd been awake for, Cole did the math, at least 22 hours, and she showed it in small ways. Her hair had come mostly down from where it had been pinned. She'd taken off the blazer she'd been wearing since the restaurant and worked in her shirt, and there was something about that, not intimate, just human, the small reduction of armor, that Cole noticed and looked away from. He called Mia at 7:15. Linda answered, said Mia was still asleep, said she'd have her call when she woke up. Cole thanked her and hung up and stood with his phone for a second, aware of the specific guilt of a single parent whose child fell asleep somewhere else without a goodnight call, even when it was unavoidable, even when the reason was legitimate. His phone buzzed. Text from Mia. "Are you coming to get me for school?" He typed back. "Yes. I'll be there by 7:45. How was sleeping over?" "Good. Kayla has a cat now." "Did you know I did not know? Can we get a cat?" "We'll talk about it." "That means no." He put the phone in his pocket. He looked at the whiteboard. He thought about what it meant to walk into Ashford Global's boardroom in a few hours with what they had, against people who had spent years preparing for every contingency, and he thought about Mia's text and the cat she wasn't going to get, and the fact that his daughter needed him to not do something catastrophically stupid today. The calculation wasn't simple. It never was. At 7:25, Janet looked up from her laptop. "Cole." Something in her voice pulled both him and Victoria to attention. "The metadata on the forged audit report," Janet said. She turned her laptop so they could see it. The document was created in a version of financial modeling software called Strategem Pro. Professional grade, expensive license. The creation date is 19 months ago, but she tapped the screen. The template it was built from is older. The base template has embedded properties going back 31 months, and the author tag on the original template file, she looked at Cole, is registered to a consulting entity called Harland Advisory Partners. Cole felt something move through him that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite cold anger, but was somewhere in the territory of both. They built the fake audit using their own template and didn't strip the metadata. They stripped the visible metadata, the surface properties. But there's a secondary layer in Strategem Pro that most people don't know exists. It records the originating template properties in a separate embedded log, and you only find it if you're looking for it specifically. Janet looked at him over the top of her glasses. This is the kind of thing that gets cases made. This puts Harlan's fingerprints on the document that was going to be used to remove the CEO of a billion-dollar company. "How solid is it?" Victoria asked. "Solid enough that a forensic examiner would be able to testify to it. Solid enough that it wouldn't be easy to challenge if you got it in front of the right people." Janet paused. Whether the right people are a courtroom or a boardroom is a different question. Cole looked at the time. 7:31. Victoria had her phone out and was already dialing. She waited, then, "Gregory, it's Victoria. I need an emergency board meeting this morning. Full board, 9 o'clock, Ashford Global Conference Room." A pause. "Because we have a material issue requiring immediate board attention, and I am still the CEO, Gregory, so you'll make it happen." Another pause, shorter. "Thank you." She hung up. She looked at Cole. "Gregory Marsh is the board chair. He's not part of this. He's been with the company for 12 years and his financial exposure is tied to the company's success, which means a forced acquisition at a deflated price hurts him personally." She exhaled. "Whether that's enough to guarantee he's actually on our side today is a different question. Who on the board might be compromised? I don't know. 2 weeks ago, I would have said none of them. Now I'm applying a different standard." She said it without bitterness, which was remarkable given the circumstances. "There are 9 board members. We need a majority. How many can you count before we walk in?" 3 that I'm certain of. 2 that I think so, but can't be sure." She looked at Cole. "We need the evidence to do the rest of the work." Cole looked at Janet. "Can you be in that room at 9? Janet looked at the time, looked at her laptop, looked at Cole with the expression she reserved for questions she'd already decided the answer to before he finished asking. "I'll need to print the analysis. Is there a printer in this office that actually works?" "Sometimes," Cole said. She made the sound again, the filing sound, and went back to her laptop. Cole went home. He had 40 minutes. He showered, changed into the dark suit he kept for the occasions that required a dark suit, and looked at himself in the bathroom mirror for about 3 seconds before deciding that was enough of that. He picked up Mia on the way. She came out of Linda's house with her backpack half-zipped and her hair in a crooked ponytail that someone had clearly attempted and partially abandoned. And she got in the car and immediately said, "You're wearing the serious suit." "I have a meeting." "Is it an important meeting?" "Kind of, yeah." She looked at him from the passenger seat with the focused attention of a 9-year-old who had learned to read her father's face the way some kids learn to read the weather. "Are you okay?" "I'm good, Bug." He glanced at her. "I'm good." She seemed to accept this with the particular trust of a child who knew when to push and when not to. "Linda's cat is named Biscuit," she said, shifting gears the way kids could. "It's orange. Very cat-like name." "Dad." "Very dignified is what I meant." She laughed. Short, honest, the laugh that still sounded the same as when she was 5. And Cole pulled into the school drop-off lane, and she climbed out and she waved without looking back, the way kids waved when they were already somewhere else in their heads. And he watched her go through the doors and sat in the drop-off lane for probably 12 seconds longer than was strictly permitted before he pulled out. The drive to Ashford Global's headquarters took 20 minutes. Cole spent most of it not thinking, which was a deliberate thing, the same deliberate emptying he'd learned to do before operations that required him to be fully present at a specific moment rather than pre-spent from anticipating it. The technique worked the same in a boardroom as it did anywhere else where the margin for error was small. You couldn't think your way into calm. You had to choose it and inhabit it. Victoria in the lobby. She'd gone home in the early hours, Cole had told her to, over her objection, because walking into a boardroom on zero sleep when you needed to project unshakable authority was not a winnable position. She'd had maybe 3 hours. She'd changed into a charcoal suit that was more structured than what she'd been wearing last night, and her hair was back up, and she looked, not refreshed exactly, but resolved, which was better. Resolve was something you could build on. Janet was already there, having arrived 15 minutes ahead of them, laptop and printed analysis tucked under her arm, and a second gas station coffee in her free hand. She'd changed her shirt. That was the only concession to the occasion that Janet Reyes was going to make, and it was enough. "The board is assembling," Victoria said quietly, as they rode the elevator up. Gregory confirmed attendance. "I don't know yet who else might have been reached by Cho or Bales between last night and this morning." "Assume they've made calls," Cole said. "I am." "Assume the narrative in that room when we walk in is that you're the problem, that you called an emergency meeting because you're acting erratically and the company's in crisis and the evidence they had last night proves it." "I know." "So we don't defend. We present." She looked at him sideways. "You've done this before." He thought of Crenshaw, of the room where the evidence had been enough but the procedure hadn't been, and the particular experience of watching something true get buried under something technical. "I've been on the losing side of it," he said. She absorbed that. The elevator opened. The Ashford Global Conference Room was on the 14th floor, and it was the kind of conference room that had been designed to project confidence. Floor-to-ceiling windows facing the Atlanta skyline, a table long enough to seat 16, chairs that cost more than Cole's monthly rent. The board members who had arrived were arranged in the way that people arranged themselves when they already sensed conflict. A few clustered near the windows talking in low voices, 2 seated at the table with the studied neutrality of people who had decided to wait, one standing near the far wall with his phone checking it. The way you checked it when you were waiting for someone to give you information you were not yet supposed to have received. Derek Cho was already there. He was standing near the windows with a cup of coffee, dressed for a normal business day, and when Victoria walked in, his face moved through something so fast that most people would have missed it. A quick recalibration, the face of a man who had expected a different morning than this one, and who was now deciding in real time how to play the morning he'd been given instead. He settled on the expression of someone who was professionally concerned about his CEO's behavior, which was a useful expression in rooms like this one. Warren Bales was seated at the table, hands folded, not making eye contact with anyone. Richard Platt was not present. That was a tactical choice. Distance, deniability, the posture of someone who was not in the room and therefore not responsible for whatever happened in it. Gregory Marsh, the board chair, was at the head of the table, 60s, solid, the unhurried manner of a man who had sat through a great many difficult meetings and had outlasted most of the difficulties. He stood when Victoria walked in. "Victoria." He reached across and shook her hand, and Cole read in the handshake, the firmness of it, The brief additional second he held it. Something that landed as close to "you have this room" as Marsh was probably going to offer. Victoria introduced Cole as her financial consultant and Janet as a forensic accounting specialist, and she did it in the flat, factual tone of a CEO introducing the people she'd brought to a meeting she'd called. And if anyone in the room had expected her to come in defensive or unsteady, that introduction recalibrated them. Cole set up Janet's laptop to display on the conference room screen. He did it without narrating it, without explaining, the same way you moved through any space where the goal was to appear as though you belonged in it entirely. Cho spoke first, while the remaining board members were still finding their seats. "Victoria, I think before we start we should address the situation from last night. There's been some concern about the nature of the meeting at Hargrove's and how—" "We'll get to last night," Victoria said. She was at the front of the table, and she didn't sit. Standing was a choice, the same way everything in a room like this was a choice. "I called this meeting because there is a material issue affecting this company that the board needs to understand. We're going to go through it now." "I think what Derek is trying to say," Bales began, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a lawyer who was choosing every word for its legal implications, "is that there may be some context missing about the purpose of—" "Warren." Victoria looked at him. Just his name and then a pause that was long enough to be uncomfortable. "Let me finish." Cole watched Bales recalculate and be quiet. Victoria nodded to Janet, who brought up the first slide on the screen. A clean, clear chart showing the 9 shell vendor entities, their formation dates, their connection to Ashford Global's accounts payable records, and the total amount of money that had moved through them over 5 years. The room looked at the number. "Over the past 5 years," Victoria said, "a network of fraudulent vendor entities has been embedded inside this company's financial infrastructure. These entities don't provide real services. They exist to extract money. The total documented to this point is what you see on that screen, and the investigation is not complete." She was good at this. Cole had watched enough people fall apart in rooms designed to take them apart to recognize the specific quality that kept you standing. Not confidence exactly. It wasn't the performed kind, but something under it, a ground-level certainty about what you knew and what it meant that couldn't be disrupted by the ambient pressure of hostile people watching you speak. Victoria had it. Whatever had been burned away in that restaurant last night, and in the hours after it, the trust, the assumptions, the belief that the people around her were what they appeared to be. What was left was something harder and clearer. "We'll now walk through the structure of these entities," she said, and Janet advanced the slide. Cho said, "Victoria, I have to ask, where did this analysis come from, and what's the chain of custody on these?" "The financial records were accessed through the company's own secure archive using credentials that belong to me," Victoria said. "The forensic analysis was performed by a certified forensic accountant with 17 years of SEC experience. I'd be happy to provide her full credentials to the board." She looked at Cole. Cole had the printed credentials. He'd asked Janet for them in the car, and he slid them across the table to Marsh without drama. Marsh picked them up and looked at them and passed them to the board member on his right. They went through it systematically. Janet walked the room through the vendor documentation, the shell company structures, the payment histories, the calibrated amounts designed to stay below audit triggers. She was not theatrical about it. She spoke the way she'd spoken in 17 years of regulatory proceedings, with the particular dry authority of someone who understood that the evidence itself was the argument, and that anything added to dress it up only gave people something to poke at. When they reached the Harland Advisory Partners connection, the vendor evaluation document embedded in the procurement folder from 4 years ago, 2 of the board members exchanged a look that Cole caught and noted. Cho spoke again. "That document doesn't establish any wrongdoing. A vendor evaluation referencing an outside firm isn't evidence of a conspiracy." His voice had shifted. He dropped the concern performance and moved to something flatter, the voice of someone making legal arguments, which was what people did when they realized the concern performance wasn't working. "By itself, no," Cole said. It was the first time he'd spoken since introductions, and the shift of attention in the room was immediate. But combined with the metadata analysis of the document that was presented to Ms. Ashford last night for her signature, "Who are you exactly?" one of the board members asked. A woman, late 50s, the particular sharpness of someone who had not survived corporate boards for 20 years by accepting unexplained people at face value. "Cole Bennett, Financial fraud investigator. I've been consulting with Victoria since last night. He didn't elaborate. He pulled up the metadata analysis on the shared screen, and Janet walked through it. The Stratagem Pro software, the template origin, the embedded log that recorded Harlan Advisory Partners as the originating author of the document's base template. That document, Cole said, is the one that was brought to a private dinner last night and presented to Victoria Ashford for her signature. It contained a fabricated audit report describing a $400 million financial crisis in this company, a crisis that does not exist, as the company's actual financial records confirm. He let that sit for exactly 2 seconds. The metadata trace places the origin of that document inside Harlan Group's infrastructure. Harlan Group, specifically through its principal, Richard Platt, organized the dinner last night at which Victoria was presented with that document under conditions that included having her phone controlled and every exit in that private room positioned strategically. That is a serious allegation, Bales said, and his voice was completely flat now. No warmth, no professional concern, nothing but the sound of a man making a calculation. It's a documented one, Cole said. The shell vendor entities trace through Delaware and 2 offshore registration jurisdictions, and they connect, through a layer of nominee directors, back to an affiliate structure that operates under the Harlan Group umbrella. Janet has the documentation if the board would like to review it. He looked at Marsh when he said it. Not at Cho, not at Bales. Marsh. Marsh was looking at the screen. He had the expression of a man running a very fast, very private calculation about liability and fiduciary responsibility and the specific jeopardy that came from being the board chair who had not noticed a 5-year financial fraud inside a company he oversaw. I'd like to see the documentation, Marsh said. Cho stood up. It was a physical signal. Standing in a room where everyone else was seated was a dominance move, the kind that either worked or made you look like you'd lost the thread. Gregory, before we go any further down this path, I think we need to acknowledge that what we're looking at is an analysis produced overnight by someone who walked into a company meeting uninvited. He glanced at Cole. Using records pulled in the middle of the night from an archive that may not have been accessed through proper governance procedures, making accusations about executives who have served this company. Derek, Victoria's voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. Sit down. He looked at her. Sit down, she said again. The thing about authority was that it wasn't in the volume. Cole had learned that in places where volume was meaningless, where the only thing that made people move was the absolute certainty in the person giving the direction. Victoria had spent the night with her company's financial guts on a whiteboard in an office that smelled like old ink, and she had come into this room knowing exactly what she was walking into, and something about having survived last night. Not cleanly, not without cost, but having survived it, had burned off whatever residual deference or doubt she might have carried in. Cho sat down. The board is going to review this documentation, Victoria said, looking at Marsh. And I am formally requesting that you authorize an independent investigation, external firm, no current Ashford relationships, to audit the vendor records, validate the forensic findings, and report to the full board. She looked at the board members one by one, the way a CEO looked at the people who were supposed to be governing the company she ran. I'm also requesting that Derek Cho and Warren Bales be placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of that investigation. Bales was very still. Cho's face had closed. Whatever calculations he'd been running were now happening somewhere inaccessible, behind an expression of professional blankness that was the last defense. You're making a significant request based on overnight work, said the board member who had asked who Cole was. Her name was Patricia Holt. Cole had learned from the nameplate in front of her. I'm making a request consistent with my responsibility as CEO, Victoria said. If the investigation finds no wrongdoing, Derek and Warren return from leave with my apology and the board's. If it finds what I believe it's going to find... She stopped. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. What about the claim of a $400 million financial crisis? Another board member asked. If someone brings that to market, the company's actual financial position is documented in the secure archive records, Janet said, from her seat along the wall. She said it matter-of-factly, the way she said everything. I can provide an independent summary of the current financial health of Ashford Global based on the records I reviewed overnight. It is not in crisis. Revenues are consistent with the last filed quarterly report, cash position is stable, and the debt structure is manageable. The $400 million figure in the document Victoria was presented last night does not correspond to anything in the company's actual records. Marsh looked at Janet. He looked at Cole. He looked at Victoria. Then he looked at the document prints that had been circulated, the metadata analysis, the Shell vendor chart, the chain of connections between Harlan Advisory Partners and the entities buried in 5 years of Ashford Global's accounts payable. "I'm going to call a brief recess," Marsh said. 15 minutes. The board members filed toward the side room. Patricia Holt paused near Victoria on her way past and said quietly, "It's solid," and kept walking. Cole moved to the window while the room cleared. He looked at Atlanta 14 floors down. The morning traffic, the construction crane 3 blocks over, the ordinary Wednesday machinery of a city that had no idea what was happening in this room. He heard footsteps and Victoria was beside him at the window. "Patricia Holt is a yes," she said quietly. "And I think Gregory is going to move the way he has to move. He has liability exposure if he doesn't act on this," Cole said. "He knows it. Derek is going to lawyer up within the hour." "Yes. Which means the clock on the independent investigation has already started," Cole said. "But the metadata evidence doesn't care about lawyers. It's in the documents. It exists independently of anything Cho or Bales say or don't say." She looked at the window rather than at the city through it, at her own reflection, briefly, and then away. "The Crenshaw case," she said, 6 years ago, the evidence you had, was procedurally compromised, and they knew how to use that. Ours isn't." "No," Cole said. "Ours isn't." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "You knew last night, when you found that vendor evaluation document with the Harlan template embedded in it. You knew this was the same operation." "I suspected." "But you knew." He thought about that. About sitting in his office at 2 a.m. looking at a document that connected the worst professional failure of his life to a case he'd been handed by a woman and a napkin and an instinct he'd almost ignored. About what it felt like to look at the same crime a second time and understand that the first time hadn't been a failure of evidence. "Yeah," he said, "I knew." She looked at him then, directly, the same way she'd looked at him through the frosted glass of the private dining room at Hargrove's. Not desperation this time, something different, something that had to do with the specific experience of trusting a stranger and having the stranger turn out to be trustworthy, which was not something that happened often enough that you took it for granted. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Below, Atlanta kept moving. The door opened and Gregory Marsh walked back in ahead of the other board members. He went to his chair at the head of the table. The other board members took their seats. Cho and Bales were still present. They hadn't left during the recess, which was either confidence or the paralysis of people who didn't yet know which way this was going to land. Marsh looked at Victoria. "I'm going to call for a motion," he said. He called for the motion to authorize an independent investigation and place Cho and Bales on administrative leave pending its outcome. He asked for a vote. 6 hands went up. Then a 7th. Tentative, but up. 7 out of 9. The motion carried. Cho pushed back from the table and stood, and he walked out of the room without looking at anyone, which was the specific exit of a man who was already on the phone to his attorney before he reached the elevator. Bales remained seated for an additional moment, long enough to be strange, not long enough to mean anything. And then he too left. Marsh looked at Victoria. "The company is going to need a statement for the record about the board's actions today." "I'll have something to you by end of day," Victoria said. The board members began gathering their things. Patricia Holt stopped near Cole on her way out and looked at him steadily. "You have a name for your firm?" "Bennett Consulting." She nodded slowly, the way people nodded when they were filing something for later use. "The forensic analysis is very good." She looked at Janet, who acknowledged this with the slight inclination of the head of someone accustomed to being told her work was very good and who had a particular tolerance for it. Then Holt left. The room emptied until it was Cole, Victoria, and Janet. Janet was already packing up her laptop with the efficiency of someone ready to move to the next thing. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Atlanta skyline did what skylines did. It simply existed, indifferent to what had just happened in the room facing it. Victoria sat down in the chair at the far end of the long conference table. She sat with her hands flat on the table and she looked at them, and Cole had the sense of someone releasing a physical tension they'd been holding for a very long time. Not collapsing, not falling apart, just the specific physiological event of a body that had been braced for impact finally getting to stand down. "It's not over," she said, without looking up. "No," Cole agreed. He sat down in the chair beside her, not across the table but beside it, which was a small thing and the right one. "The independent investigation is going to take months. There'll be legal proceedings. Harlan Group is going to fight it." "I know." "Platt will use every procedural tool available to distance himself from the documents." "I know that too." "But the metadata trail exists," Cole said. "Janet's analysis is in the record now. The board has acted. That's a different position than you were in at 8 o'clock last night." She looked up. There was something in her face that was not triumph. She was too smart and too tired for triumph, but something close to the feeling of ground beneath your feet after a long time without it. "How is it that you were in that restaurant last night?" she said. "The specific restaurant, the specific night." "Canceled meeting. I didn't feel like driving back on an empty stomach." She looked at him. "That's it?" "That's it." She shook her head once, the small headshake of someone confronting a thing that was too contingent to be comfortable. The narrowness of the margin, the sheer ordinary accident of a man sitting at a corner table because he was hungry and the traffic on Peachtree was a disaster. "If you hadn't been there." "I was there," Cole said. Janet zipped her laptop bag. "I'll send the full written report by Thursday," she said, pulling on her jacket. She looked at Cole. "You're buying me dinner." "I know." "Real dinner, not gas station coffee." "I know, Janet." She left. Her footsteps down the hallway were brisk and diminishing, and then the elevator opened and closed and she was gone, and Cole and Victoria were alone in the long conference room with the city through the windows and the remains of the morning on the table in front of them. Victoria looked at the chair where Derek Cho had been sitting. The chair was still pushed back from where he'd stood and left. Nobody had moved it. 4 years, she said. He was in this building for 4 years. Cole didn't say anything, because there was nothing useful to add to that. Some things were just what they were. After a moment, Victoria pulled the chair toward her and straightened it, aligned it back with the table, the way you straightened a chair when you needed to do something with your hands, and what you actually needed to do was too large for this moment. She stood back and looked at the table, the long, expensive table with the chairs now properly arranged, the whiteboard at the far end with the agenda Gregory Marsh had written on it for a meeting that had not gone the way anyone except Cole and Victoria had planned. "What happens now?" she said. "Now," Cole said, "you run your company." He stood. "And I go get my daughter from school." She looked at him. "She wants a cat," he said. Something crossed Victoria's face, surprised, briefly, by the absolute ordinariness of it in the middle of everything else. And then something that might have been the beginning of a real smile, the unguarded kind that happened when you weren't expecting to feel anything and felt something anyway. "Are you getting her one?" she said. "Probably not," Cole said. "But I'm going to think about it." He picked up his jacket. He walked to the conference room door. He paused there for a moment, not for any dramatic reason, just the natural hesitation of leaving a room where something significant had happened. And then he went through it and down the hall toward the elevator, and behind him in the long conference room with the Atlanta skyline in the windows, Victoria Ashford turned back toward the table and the company that was still hers. The independent investigation firm the board hired was called Mercer Caldwell Associates, a name that meant nothing to most people, and a great deal to anyone who had spent time on the wrong side of a corporate fraud case. They were out of Washington, D.C., with satellite offices in 4 cities, and their standard rate suggested they understood their own value. Gregory Marsh had insisted on them specifically, which told Cole something about how seriously Marsh was now taking his own liability exposure. When a board chair starts thinking about himself, the investigation gets real resources. They moved fast. Within 72 hours of the board vote, Mercer Caldwell had teams inside Ashford Global's financial systems, server logs, and procurement records. They interviewed department heads, accounts payable staff, anyone who had touched the vendor approval process in the last 5 years. They pulled email archives. They requested records from the shell companies through legal channels that were going to take time to produce, but that created a documented paper trail regardless. Cole wasn't part of the Mercer Caldwell investigation. He'd handed them Janet's forensic analysis, the whiteboard documentation he'd photographed, the shell company map, all of it, And then he stepped back because his role was not to run investigations for billion-dollar companies. His role had been to keep one from being stolen on a Tuesday night, and that part was done. He went back to Clement Street. He cleared the second desk. He erased the whiteboard, which took longer than expected because dry erase markers that have been on a board since 3 in the morning develop opinions about being removed. He opened a window and let the early October air move through the office, and he sat at his desk and looked at the empty whiteboard and thought about the Crenshaw case for the first time in a while without the specific weight of failure attached to it. That was new. The weeks that followed had their own texture. Mia had a school project about Georgia state history that required poster board and a level of parental involvement. Cole hadn't anticipated, and he spent a Thursday evening cutting out printed photographs of historical sites while she dictated captions with the authority of a 9-year-old who had done extensive research and had strong feelings about font choices. He made her dinner. He helped with math homework on 2 separate occasions that reminded him he remembered very little about fractions. He took her to her Saturday soccer game and watched her play with the focused attention of a former SEAL who found youth soccer tactically baffling but emotionally engaging in ways he couldn't entirely explain. He talked to Victoria twice in the first 2 weeks. Both times brief, professional, updates on what Mercer Caldwell was finding, questions about documentation Cole had access to that the investigation needed. She was running her company in the middle of all of it, which meant she was in back-to-back situations simultaneously, managing a board that was newly attentive and somewhat anxious, keeping her executive team stable in the absence of a COO and general counsel, dealing with the inevitable market speculation that followed any public acknowledgement of a pending internal investigation. She sounded tired in both calls but functional, and Cole didn't ask anything beyond what was necessary because she didn't have the bandwidth for anything beyond what was necessary. Marcus Hale came back from Singapore. Cole heard about it from Victoria in the 3rd week. A short text, late evening. Marcus is back. Meeting with Mercer Caldwell tomorrow. I still don't know. He texted back. Whatever it is, now you'll know. She didn't respond to that, which he understood. The answer, when it came, was complicated. The way the answers in these situations were always complicated. Marcus Hale had not been an architect of the fraud. What he had been was a man who had seen something wrong approximately 3 years ago, an irregularity in a vendor payment that didn't match the service record, and who had made the specific human error of raising it quietly with Derek Cho, whom he'd trusted, rather than escalating it formally. Cho had explained it away. Marcus had accepted the explanation. And in doing so, Marcus had handed Cho something valuable, the knowledge of exactly how much the CFO was paying attention and where the gaps were. After that, the payments had been more carefully structured to stay within the ranges. Marcus wasn't scrutinizing. When the Mercer Caldwell investigators put Marcus's account alongside the payment records, the timeline was clear. He hadn't signed off on fraud knowingly. He'd been managed around it by someone who understood how he worked. That distinction mattered legally and it mattered personally, though the personal part was going to take longer to resolve than the legal part. Victoria told Cole this on the phone, and she was quiet for a moment after she finished explaining it, and then she said, "He cried. In the meeting with the investigators. He's been with me for 6 years and he sat there and..." She stopped. "He made a mistake," Cole said. "A bad one." "Yeah, a bad one." Cole was at his desk looking out the window at Clement Street. "But he made it because he trusted the wrong person. That's different from being the wrong person." She was quiet for another moment. "I know," she said. "I'm working on knowing it." By the end of the 6th week, Mercer Caldwell's preliminary findings were significant enough that the FBI's Financial Crimes Division opened a parallel inquiry. This was the thing that changed the temperature of everything. Federal involvement reordered the structure of the whole situation. Harlan Group's attorneys, who had been operating with the confidence of a firm that had successfully defended regulatory challenges before, encountered a different kind of attention than they were accustomed to managing. Subpoenas arrived. Documents were frozen. The nominee directors on the shell companies, lawyers and administrative figureheads who had lent their names to LLCs for fee payments and asked no questions, began having conversations with federal prosecutors about the specific math of cooperation. Richard Platt retained 3 attorneys. This was reported in a brief item in a financial news outlet, and Cole read it over his morning coffee and felt something that took him a moment to identify. It wasn't satisfaction, exactly. It was the feeling of something long suspended finally beginning to move. A wheel that had been stuck for 6 years, groaning under pressure, finally turning. Derek Cho's attorney issued a statement asserting his client's full cooperation with investigators, while simultaneously denying any criminal wrongdoing, which was the legal equivalent of two incompatible things existing in the same sentence and hoping nobody noticed. Warren Bales, through his attorneys, declined to make any public statement, which was smarter. Cole received a call from an FBI financial crimes agent named Darren Okafor in the 7th week. Okafor was precise, unhurried, the kind of federal agent who had decided at some point in his career that patience was a more reliable tool than pressure. He asked Cole to come in and walk through what he'd found in the night preceding the board meeting, the shell vendor structure, the metadata analysis, the Harlan Advisory Partners connection. Cole did, for 3 hours, in a federal building downtown, with Janet Reyes present because she was the one who could speak to the forensic analysis with professional authority. At the end of the session, Okafor looked at the documentation Cole had brought, printed, organized, the same work from that overnight session on Clement Street, now sitting in a federal building under fluorescent light, and said, "This was done in one night?" "Most of it," Cole said, "by you and a forensic accountant." "And the CEO who pulled the records?" Okafor looked at the documents again and made a note. "There's a case from 6 years ago," he said, without inflection. "Crenshaw Distribution." Cole looked at him. "Our analysts found the pattern overlap when they started mapping the Harlan Group structure," Okafor said. "The shell company architecture from the Ashford case has genetic similarities to what was running inside Crenshaw before the acquisition. Same formation strategies, same nominee director network in Delaware, similar calibration of payment amounts to avoid automatic audit flags." He paused. "Were you aware of the Crenshaw case?" "I investigated it," Cole said. Okafor's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his attention. "The private investigation that was closed is inconclusive." "That's the one." The agent made another note. I was quiet for a moment, in the way that federal agents were quiet when they were deciding how much to say. "The Crenshaw file is going to be reopened as part of this inquiry," he said, "for completeness. The statute of limitations on some of the elements has run, but not all of them. And the network that operated inside Crenshaw is the same network operating inside Ashford Global." He looked at Cole steadily. "Your original investigation is going to become part of the documented history of this operation. In that context, the closure of your case as inconclusive will look different than it did 6 years ago." Cole held that for a moment. He didn't say anything because there was nothing to say that wasn't obvious. The thing he'd known 6 years ago, that the evidence was right and the procedure had been weaponized against it, was going to be stated in plain bureaucratic language in a federal investigative record. It wasn't an apology. The federal government didn't do apologies, but it was something. "All right," Cole said. On the drive back to Clement Street, he called Mia's school to confirm pickup time for a half day he'd almost forgotten about. He sat in traffic on the connector and listened to the radio without hearing it, and thought about a logistics company that had been taken apart 14 years ago while a family watched and couldn't stop it, and whether those people knew that the machine that had taken their company apart was now visible on the record of a federal investigation, connected, documented, the whole architecture finally exposed to light. He thought about calling them. He decided not to, at least not yet. That wasn't his call to make. He picked up Mia. She got in the car with a half-eaten granola bar and the energy of a 9-year-old who had been released from school 3 hours early and had opinions about what to do with that time. She wanted to go to the park. Cole took her to the park. He sat on a bench and watched her run a circuit that appeared to have rules she had invented and was enforcing on herself. And he felt, not peace exactly, not the absence of things that still needed to happen, but something quieter than he'd felt in a long time. A specific stillness that had something to do with a wheel turning, with a long patience finally arriving at something. He texted Victoria from the bench, "Meeting with federal investigators today. They're reopening Crenshaw as part of the Harlan inquiry." She responded in 4 minutes. "I know. Okafor called me this morning. How are you?" He looked at the text for a moment. It was a simple question, the kind people asked without thinking, but the specific circumstances of who was asking and what the day had been made it carry more weight than usual. "Okay," he typed. "Mia's at the park trying to win a race against herself. Is she winning? Hard to say. The rules keep changing. A pause. Then, that sounds about right. He put the phone away. Mia made another circuit and collapsed dramatically on the grass in the way of children who experienced every physical event at full volume. And Cole watched her and thought that this, the bench, the park, the 9-year-old inventing her own rules, was the part of his life that had kept going even when everything else was in pieces, and was still here, still running its circuits, still carrying him forward even when he hadn't noticed it doing so. The federal investigation moved through the months that followed with the implacable deliberateness of things that had enough evidence to be patient. By the end of the 4th month, 3 individuals had been charged: Warren Bales and 2 principals from the Harlan Group affiliate structure. Bales's attorney entered into preliminary cooperation discussions within 2 weeks of the charges. Derek Cho was charged in the 5th month, his cooperation deal more complex and less favorable than Bales's, negotiated through 6 weeks of back and forth that resolved in a plea agreement that required him to provide documented testimony about the full operational history of the scheme going back to its inception at Ashford Global. Richard Platt was the last and the hardest. His 3 attorneys became 4. The legal maneuvering was extensive and sophisticated, precisely what you expected from a man who had built his entire operational model around knowing how legal processes worked and where their pressure points were. But the difference between the Crenshaw case and the Ashford case was that this time the procedural challenge had nowhere to land. The metadata evidence was self-contained and independently verified. The shell company documentation had been subpoenaed through proper federal channels. The network of nominee directors who were cooperating with prosecutors provided corroborating testimony that didn't depend on anything Cole had done or how he'd done it. Platt was indicted in the 6th month on charges that included wire fraud, conspiracy, and securities fraud. He made bail. His photograph appeared in the same financial news outlet that had reported his attorney's situation, and this time the item was not brief. Cole read it at his desk on Clement Street. The office smelled the same as it always had. He had a new case, a smaller one, a regional manufacturing company whose procurement manager was suspected of a straightforward kickback arrangement with a supplier. It was the kind of work Cole had been doing for years, unglamorous and necessary, the daily reality of financial fraud being mostly small and mostly local rather than vast and architecturally sophisticated. He was good at it. He found it satisfying in the plain way you found satisfying the thing you were genuinely built to do. His phone rang. Victoria. He answered. I saw the news. I wanted to make sure you saw it, she said. Before I heard from anyone else, I wanted to... She stopped, started again. Okafor called me this morning. He said the Crenshaw reopening has produced enough corroborating documentation that the original investigation is being formally noted in the federal record as accurate. He said it in very careful federal language, but what he meant was, I know what he meant. Cole. I know, he said. I heard it when he said it to me last week. She was quiet for a moment. He could hear something in the background on her end. Office sounds, the ambient hum of a company that was still running, that had come through the last 6 months intact, if not undamaged. How's the company? He said. Complicated. The word came out with the specific weight of someone who had been managing a complicated situation for long enough that the word itself had become a unit of measure. The board authorized a new oversight structure, independent audit committee, external vendor verification, all of it. It's the right thing. It's also a lot of infrastructure to build while running everything else. A pause. Marcus is staying. Yeah. He wanted to resign. I told him no. She paused. I told him I needed someone who understood what happened and why, and who would spend the rest of his career making sure it didn't happen again. That was more useful to me than a clean slate. Cole leaned back in his chair. Outside his window, Clement Street was doing its mid-morning things. A delivery truck double-parked, someone walking a large and apparently opinionated dog past the building, the ordinary choreography of a city block going about its Tuesday. That was the right call, he said. I don't always make the right calls. Nobody does. Another pause, longer this time, the kind of pause that had something in it other than dead air. I wanted to ask you something, Victoria said, in person, but I keep not finding the right time to do it in person, so I'm going to ask it now. Okay. The night at Hargrove's, when you walked into that room. She stopped. You'd been asked, essentially, to stay out of other people's situations. You'd made a decision after the last time. You told me that, and you walked in anyway. Yes. Why? Cole looked at the empty whiteboard on the left wall, the clean white of it. He thought about the specific 2 seconds at the corner table, the frosted glass, the arrangement of bodies, the woman performing stillness so precisely that the performance itself was what gave her away. He thought about a word in eyeliner on a dinner napkin. I've spent 6 years being the person who had it right and couldn't do anything about it, he said. And then someone handed me a situation where I could do something about something, immediately, right then. He paused. I wasn't thinking about the Crenshaw case when I walked in there. I was thinking about the napkin. But I think, looking back, that not walking in would have been choosing to keep being that person. And I'd been that person long enough. The line was quiet. That's a very honest answer, Victoria said. You asked an honest question. She laughed once, short, genuine, the kind that happened when you weren't expecting it. Can I take you to dinner? Not a work dinner, an actual dinner, without a hidden agenda or a fabricated audit or someone trying to take anything from anyone. Cole looked at his desk. At the new case file, the regional manufacturer, the kickback arrangement, the entirely normal scale of the thing, at the window with the delivery truck and the opinionated dog and the ordinary Tuesday outside it. At his phone with Mia's last text still on the screen, a photo of a spider she'd found in the school bathroom that she'd sent with the caption, "Thought you would want to know." Yeah, he said, I think that's possible. Saturday? I have Mia's soccer game in the morning. How late does it run? 11, usually, depending on how long she spends arguing with the referee about calls she disagrees with. Another pause, then, does she do that often? More than you'd think for a 9-year-old. Saturday evening, then, Victoria said. I'll find somewhere without a private dining room. That would be appreciated. He hung up. He looked at the window for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. The delivery truck had moved on. The dog and its owner had gone around the corner. The street outside was just a street, doing what streets did, holding things up, carrying people from one place to another, indifferent to the weight of any particular journey. Cole opened the new case file. He read the first page. He picked up a pen and made a note in the margin, the way he always started. A single thread. A question mark. The first small pull on the thing that would eventually unravel. He had work to do. The weeks continued. The federal case built its structure with the patience of something that had enough material to take its time. Platt's legal team filed motions, and the motions were addressed, and the process ground forward the way federal processes ground forward. Not dramatically, not quickly, but with a cumulative weight that made it very difficult for even sophisticated defense attorneys to redirect. The plea agreements from Bales and Cho produced documented testimony that ran to several hundred pages and connected the Harlan Group operation to 4 other corporate targets over 12 years, 2 of which had resulted in completed acquisitions that investigators were now examining for fraudulent inducement. Crenshaw Distribution was in there. The full mechanism of what had been done to that company, documented now in cooperation testimony, entered the federal record in the 9th month of the investigation. The acquisition that had stripped the family of what they'd built at 40 cents on the dollar was now described in specific operational terms. Who had built the shell vendors, who had forged the financial reporting, who had manufactured the crisis that made the acquisition appear necessary and inevitable. Cole received a call he hadn't been expecting in the 9th month on a Friday afternoon from a woman named Carol Crenshaw, the daughter of the man who had founded Crenshaw Distribution, now in her late 40s, living in Charlotte. She'd found his name through the federal case filings, where his original investigation was referenced as part of the documented history of the Harlan Group operation. She called to tell him that the family had retained counsel and was pursuing a civil case against Harlan Group and its affiliates. She called to tell him that they had read the original investigation, his investigation, and that it had described exactly what had happened to them, accurately, 6 years before anyone else had been able to prove it. She did not cry during the call. She was direct and measured, the way people were when they had been waiting a long time for something and had learned, in that waiting, not to spend their relief too fast. Cole said he was glad the case had progressed to a point where it was useful to them. He said he hoped the civil matter went the way it should. He said it had been his work, that the evidence had been right, and that sometimes things took longer to land than they should. She thanked him. He said she didn't need to. She said she did, and she wanted to, and he let her. After the call, he sat at his desk for a while. He didn't do anything useful. He just sat there with the afternoon light coming through the window and the old paper smell of the office around him and the specific feeling of something closing, not ending, not resolving into simplicity, but closing the way a wound closed, leaving something behind. He texted Mia because she was the person he texted when he didn't know what else to do with the feeling. How was school? She responded in 30 seconds. Fine. Can Biscuit come for a sleepover? He stared at this. Biscuit is Linda's cat, Mia. I know. That's why I'm asking if she can come for a sleepover. She would like our apartment. How do you know what Biscuit would like? Dad. She's a cat. She would like everywhere. Cole put his phone face down on the desk and looked at the ceiling and felt, in spite of everything, in spite of the 9 months and the federal case and the 6-year wait that was finally lifting, something uncomplicated and immediate. He felt like laughing. So he did. Briefly, quietly, in his empty office on Clement Street, with nobody watching. Then he picked up the phone and typed, I'll ask Linda. By the time the federal case reached its resolution in the 12th month, Platt's legal team, finding the walls consistently holding, negotiating a plea arrangement that was significantly less favorable than what earlier cooperation might have secured. The total documented financial harm across all Harlan Group targets had been established at a figure that made the numbers from that first overnight session on the whiteboard look like a preliminary sketch. The sentencing proceedings were scheduled for the following spring. Cole would be called as a witness. He'd been told this by Okafor with the matter-of-fact precision of someone scheduling logistics, and Cole had said he'd be there, and he would be. In the meantime, there was a manufacturing case with a procurement manager and a supplier relationship that needed careful documentation, and a referral from Patricia Holt, the Ashford board member, for a real estate development company that was concerned about financial irregularities in a subsidiary, and an email from a law firm in Chicago about a potential engagement that would require travel. There was a Saturday dinner at a restaurant in Midtown that Victoria had found with good lighting and no private dining room and a menu that listed prices. She'd arrived 7 minutes late because of a call she couldn't end on time, and she'd apologized in the specific way of someone who was not accustomed to apologizing for her schedule and was making a deliberate effort to practice it, and Cole had said he'd ordered water and the bread was good. She'd sat down across from him and looked at him and said, "You look better." "Then what?" "Than the last time I saw you in a restaurant." He thought about that. The corner table, the frosted glass, a woman performing stillness across a private dining room. "I had more sleep this time," he said. "That helps?" They'd had dinner, real dinner, with prices on the menu and no one watching the exits and nothing that needed to be signed or prevented or exposed. They'd talked about Mia's soccer team, which had lost its last 2 games in ways that Mia had strong opinions about. They'd talked about the changes Victoria was making to the company's internal structure, not because it was a work dinner, but because it was what Victoria thought about, and she was someone who talked about what she thought about. They'd talked about Atlanta in October, and a book Cole had read on someone's recommendation, and whether Janet Reyes was as consistently annoyed at everyone as she seemed, or just at Cole specifically. Victoria had said, "I think it's everyone, but you get a dedicated version." Cole had said, "That tracks." It wasn't a dramatic evening. It wasn't the beginning of something that announced itself as a beginning. It was just dinner, and it was the first dinner in a long time that Cole had sat through without looking at the exits. And when it was over, they'd stood outside on the sidewalk in the October air, and Victoria had said she'd see him, and Cole had said yes, and they'd gone their separate ways into the ordinary Atlanta night. He drove home. He checked on Mia, who was asleep with one arm off the bed in the specific boneless way that children slept, her soccer cleats still on the floor where she'd dropped them after practice. He picked the cleats up and put them by the door. He turned off the hall light. He stood in the kitchen for a moment in the quiet apartment and thought, not about anything specific, just the general shape of things. Where they'd been 12 months ago, where they were now, the distance between those 2 points and what it had taken to cover it. He was tired in the good way, the way that meant something had been done. He went to bed. Spring arrived in Atlanta the way it usually did, not gradually, but all at once, like a decision that had been made somewhere else and simply implemented overnight. 1 week the trees were bare and the mornings had teeth, and then suddenly the dogwoods were out and the air smelled like something beginning. and people who had been walking fast with their heads down started walking slower and looking up. Cole noticed it on a Tuesday morning, driving Mia to school with the windows down for the first time since October. She had her arm out the window the way kids did when they discovered they could. Again, hand cutting through the air, and she was talking about something that had happened at lunch the day before, a disagreement between two of her friends that had apparently involved a misunderstanding about whose turn it was to pick the game at recess, the kind of social complexity that was genuinely urgent at 9 years old, and that Cole listened to with the full attention it deserved, because the things that mattered to Mia were the things that mattered, full stop. He dropped her off. He watched her go through the doors. He drove to Clement Street. The sentencing hearings were scheduled to begin in 11 days. He'd been deposed twice in the preceding months, once for the federal case, once for the civil suit that Carol Crenshaw's family had filed against Harlan Group's affiliates. Both sessions had been long and detailed and had required Cole to reconstruct, in precise sequential order, the work he'd done during the Crenshaw investigation 12 years ago and the connections he'd drawn in the overnight session at Clement Street. He'd done it clearly. He'd answered what he was asked and not elaborated beyond it, which was what his attorney had advised and which happened to also be his natural inclination. The depositions were over. What remained was the courtroom, and it was coming. He tried not to think about it constantly. He was mostly successful. He had the Chicago engagement, the law firm referral that had required 3 trips, and was now deep enough into documentation that it would carry him through the next 2 months. He had the real estate development case from Patricia Holt's referral, which had turned out to be more complex than initially described, as these things usually did. He had a daughter whose soccer team had found its footing and won 3 consecutive games, which Mia was handling with the specific modesty of someone who was not particularly modest about it. Life ran its regular machinery alongside the thing that was coming. That was the truth of it. You didn't pause your life for the significant events. They happened inside the life, woven through the ordinary days, and the ordinary days kept going around them. Victoria called him the Thursday before the hearings began. Not about the case. Okafor had handled all the direct case communication for months. She called because she called him sometimes now, the way people called each other when they'd been through something together, and the being through it had created a kind of frequency between them that neither of them had formally named. "Are you ready?" she said. "For the hearings?" "Yes." Cole was at his desk. Outside, Clement Street had its spring version going. More people on the sidewalk, a woman at the cafe across the street who had taken her coffee to an outdoor table, the delivery truck that was always double parked doing exactly that. "I'd have been ready for 6 years," he said. "I just didn't know it was this specific thing I was getting ready for." "That's a very philosophical answer." "I've had time to think about it." She was quiet for a moment. He'd learned her silences. There were different kinds. This one was the kind that had something in it she was deciding whether to say. "I've been thinking about what you said when I asked you why you walked into that room." "What about it?" "You said you'd been the person who had it right and couldn't do anything about it for 6 years, and you didn't want to keep being that person." She paused. "I've been thinking about the equivalent of that for me, the thing I'd been for too long." "What's that?" "Someone who built walls instead of systems," she said. "I thought I was protecting the company by keeping things close, by not letting anyone too far in. And what I actually did was create exactly the conditions where people like Cho could operate without enough oversight, because I was so focused on trusting my inner circle completely that I never asked whether the circle itself had been compromised." She said it the way she'd learned to say the hard things about herself. Directly, without flinching, but also without the performative self-flagellation that some people used as a substitute for actually changing. "I was very good at running a company, and I had a significant blind spot, and those two things coexisted for years." "Most people's blind spots are in the area they're most confident about," Cole said. "That's not comforting. It's not meant to be. It's just true." She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. "Thank you for that." "You asked." "I did." Another pause. "I want you to know, before next week, before everything gets formal and official, and on the record, that what you did that night mattered, not just for the company, not just for the legal outcome. It mattered in the way that things matter when someone sees a situation clearly and chooses to do something about it at personal cost." She stopped. "I'm not good at saying things like this." "You're doing fine." "Cole." I hear you, he said. And he meant it, not as a deflection but as actual acknowledgement, the kind that landed. He'd grown up in a particular world where what you did was its own statement, and articulating it was considered redundant at best and suspect at worst. And he'd carried that into civilian life in ways that weren't always useful. Being told that something mattered was not nothing. He was old enough to know that now. Thank you. Okay, she said, with the specific relief of someone who has said the thing and had it received. Good. Have a dinner with me Friday, he said, before the week starts. Yes, she said, without the pause that might have meant she was weighing it. The sentencing hearings ran across 2 weeks in April. Cole testified on the 4th day. He sat in the witness chair and answered questions with the deliberate clarity of someone who had thought carefully about precision, because precision was the thing that held up, and vagueness was the thing that got taken apart. He described the methodology of the overnight investigation, how they'd accessed the records, what they'd found, in what sequence, how the analysis had been conducted, and by whom. He described the Harlan Advisory Partners template embedded in the forged audit document. He described the shell vendor architecture. Platt's defense attorney cross-examined him for an hour and 40 minutes. The attorney was skilled, the kind of skilled that came from decades of knowing exactly where the seams were in an opposing argument and pressing them with patience and precision. He challenged the independence of the investigation given Cole's personal history with Harlan Group through the Crenshaw case. He questioned the chain of custody on the documents accessed overnight. He suggested that the metadata analysis, however technically sound, had been conducted under conditions that introduced interpretive bias. Cole answered each question with the same unruffled flatness. He didn't get defensive. He didn't elaborate into territory he hadn't been asked about. He held the line of what he knew, what he'd done, and what the documentation showed, and he let the documentation speak for the parts where his own credibility was being questioned, because the documentation didn't have a personal history with anyone and couldn't be imputed with motive. When it was over and he stepped down, he was aware that his hands were entirely steady, which felt significant in a way he didn't examine too closely. Janet testified the following day. She was extraordinary, dry, specific, unimpressible, under cross-examination in the way of someone who had been cross-examined by federal defense attorneys for 20 years and had arrived at a settled opinion about the experience. When Platt's attorney suggested that the metadata analysis required assumptions that went beyond the evidence, Janet looked at him over her reading glasses and said, "The embedded log is a documented feature of Strategy Pro software. I'm describing what it contains. I'm not making assumptions. You may want to review the software documentation." The courtroom was quiet for a moment after that. Cole was seated in the gallery. He watched Janet's face when the attorney moved on to a different line of questioning, and her face said nothing at all, which was exactly right. The testimony from Bales's cooperation agreement was read into the record across 2 sessions. It was detailed and operational. Dates, names, specific instructions, the architecture of how the scheme had been constructed inside Ashford Global from the inside. Cho's cooperation testimony was similar in structure and more specific in certain areas because Cho had been closer to the daily mechanics. Together, they described operation that had started with a Harlan Group analysis of potential acquisition targets, had identified Ashford Global's growth trajectory as the target, had placed Cho inside the company through a recruitment process that had been engineered to make him look like the right candidate, and had run for 4 years with the patience of people who intended to win. Hearing it laid out in that sequence, the full timeline, from targeting to placement to the dinner at Hargrove's, did something to Cole that he hadn't entirely prepared for. It wasn't the scale of it, though the scale was significant. It was the patience, the years of careful construction, the willingness to wait for exactly the right moment. He'd known it intellectually. He'd mapped it on the whiteboard. He'd seen it in the records. But hearing it spoken aloud in a courtroom, in chronological order, made it real in a different way, made it human in the worst sense. Not the evil that was extraordinary and therefore distant, but the ordinary human capacity for sustained dishonesty in pursuit of a defined goal, which was a more uncomfortable thing to sit with. He sat with it. Richard Platt did not testify on his own behalf. His attorneys offered character witnesses and expert testimony, challenging the forensic methodology. But the accumulated weight of cooperation testimony, documentary evidence, and federal forensic analysis had built a structure that character witnesses couldn't counterbalance. The jury, it had been moved to trial rather than plea, Platt's attorneys having gambled on a contested case and lost the gamble, deliberated for 2.5 days. The verdict on the primary charges was delivered on a Wednesday morning. Cole was in the gallery. Victoria was 2 rows ahead of him, with her own attorney beside her. He could see the back of her head, the set of her shoulders, the composed posture he'd first seen through frosted glass in a restaurant, the posture that was no longer a performance but had become something more like actual ground. Guilty. On 11 of 14 counts, Bales had already been sentenced. 3 years, federal minimum security, a cooperation credit that had reduced what would otherwise have been significantly more. Cho received 4 years and 8 months, the additional time reflecting his closer operational involvement. 2 Harlan Group principals received sentences in the range of 6 to 8 years. Platt received 12 years. Cole heard the number and felt something move through him that he didn't try to name because naming it would have required making it smaller than it was. 12 years. The man who had built the machine that had taken apart a family's company had spent 6 years operating it against detection, had aimed it at Ashford Global with the patience of someone who fully expected to win, was going to spend 12 years in a federal facility. It was not everything. It was not a restoration of the Crenshaw family's losses, which were civil matters still working their way through a separate process. It was not an erasure of the years Cole had spent knowing something was true and being unable to prove it. It was what the legal system could do, which was not the same as everything that should happen and was also not nothing. Outside the courthouse, in the April afternoon, Victoria found him on the steps. She was still with her attorney, who peeled off toward a waiting car after a brief exchange. She walked over to where Cole was standing, and they stood side by side for a moment looking at the street. The ordinary weekday traffic, people moving on the sidewalk with the focused efficiency of people who had places to be. A city going about its afternoon with no particular awareness of what had just concluded inside the building behind them. 12 years, she said. Yes. Is that what you expected? I didn't let myself expect, Cole said. I've been wrong enough times about outcomes to have learned not to. She looked at him. She'd gotten better at looking at him directly in the months since the restaurant. Or maybe she'd always been that way, and he'd just gotten used to it, to being looked at by someone who wasn't performing anything. How do you feel? He thought about it honestly, the way the question deserved. Like something finished, he said. Not fixed. Not like it was before. But finished. She nodded slowly. She understood the distinction. He knew she did, because she'd made a version of it herself, in the months of rebuilding the company's infrastructure and the slower, more private work of reassessing what she knew about the people around her and herself. You didn't come out of something like this the same. You came out carrying it, which was different from being defined by it, and the difference was the whole thing. The Crenshaw family's civil suit, she said. Carol Crenshaw reached out to me. Cole looked at her. When? Last month. She wanted to speak with me, as another target of the same operation. We talked for about an hour. Victoria paused. She's impressive. The way she described the years after the acquisition, watching what had been built get broken up and sold off in pieces, knowing something had been done to them but not having the mechanism to prove it. She stopped. She said the federal case gave them the documentation they needed. She said your name. Cole looked at the street. She said the original investigation had described exactly what happened, that reading it was like, she said it was like finding a photograph of a crime scene that no one had believed existed. Victoria paused. I thought you should know she said that. He didn't trust himself to say much, so he said, I'm glad the document survived. Are you going to reach out to her? I already did, last week. We spoke for about 20 minutes. He was quiet for a moment. She's going to be all right. They stood there a little longer. The April afternoon kept doing what April afternoons did. The light at that particular angle. The temperature that was just right. The feeling of a season that had finally arrived after a long wait. Cole had always had a complicated relationship with spring, the way it insisted on renewal regardless of whether you were ready for it. This year, it felt less like an imposition. They had dinner that evening, the two of them, at a place Victoria knew in Inman Park, with exposed brick and a menu that changed seasonally and a noise level that required you to lean in to hear the other person clearly. which, Cole thought, was not the worst condition for a conversation. She told him about the restructuring at Ashford Global, the new compliance architecture, the independent vendor verification process, the audit committee that was now genuinely independent rather than nominally so. She talked about it the way she talked about work, with focus and a specific pleasure in the details that Cole had come to recognize as one of the things that made her who she was. She loved the actual substance of what she did, not the title, not the status, the machinery of it, the problem solving, the specific satisfaction of a system that worked. That hadn't changed. Marcus presented the new CFO-level controls to the board last week, she said. He'd built in a secondary verification layer for all vendor payments above a certain threshold. It was genuinely good work. She paused. He stood up there and presented it, and I watched the board take it seriously, and I thought, this is what it looks like when something bad produces something good. Not despite it, because of it. He needed to do that, Cole said. I know. I think he needed to do it in public, in front of the board, as much as anything else. She looked in at her glass. He's going to spend a long time making up for a decision he made in 30 seconds 4 years ago. I don't know if he can fully get there, but watching him try is worth something. Cole thought about the specific weight of that. The man who had made a small decision that opened a large door and who was now living inside the consequences of it with enough self-awareness to understand exactly what he was doing. Some people in that position became defensive, rewrote the story to make themselves the victim of circumstances. Marcus had apparently not done that. That was its own kind of character. What are you going to do with the consulting firm? Victoria asked. Now that this is over. Keep doing what I do, Cole said. The Chicago case is going to run through the summer. Patricia Holt's referral is more complex than I initially thought. And I'm getting more calls than I was a year ago, which I think is partially the federal case making noise. Your reputation, she said. My reputation, he agreed without irony. The word had a different weight now than it had carried for 6 years. Not restored exactly, because it had never been publicly damaged in any documented way. But inside the professional world where these things were known and discussed, the outcome of the Ashford case and the reopening of the Crenshaw file had changed what people understood about Cole Bennett's judgment. The investigation that had been closed as inconclusive had been confirmed, through federal process, as correct. In a field where correctness was the currency, that was real. He hadn't sought it out. He hadn't needed anyone to announce it. It existed in the record, and people who needed to know it would find it there. Mia wants to meet you, he said. Victoria looked at him. She knows I've been working with someone on a case for the past several months. She's 9, so she has limited interest in the legal and financial details. But she has significant interest in the people. He looked at his glass. She asked last week if you were nice. I said you were direct. She said that usually meant the same thing. Victoria was quiet for a moment. She sounds like someone I'd like. She is, Cole said. She's also a lot. She'll ask you questions that you don't expect, and she'll know if you're not answering them honestly, which is something I don't entirely understand but have learned to respect. I can handle questions. I know you can. Can she handle a dinner at a restaurant with prices on the menu? Cole considered this. She'll want to know why the menu doesn't have pictures. Victoria laughed. The real one. The unguarded one that she'd had in the conference room when Cole had said Mia was trying to win a race against herself. He'd been collecting those without meaning to, the way you collected things you didn't realize had value until you had several of them. They walked out into the Inman Park evening afterward. Along the sidewalk, under the trees that were fully green now, the neighborhood settled into its spring version of itself. They walked without a specific destination, which was rare for both of them. Two people who were professionally inclined toward destinations, toward the defined endpoint of a thing. It was comfortable, the walking without a plan. Another thing Cole hadn't had much practice with. I've been thinking about the napkin, Victoria said. He glanced at her. What about it? I've been thinking about why I wrote one word instead of 2 or 3. Why just help and not please help me, or something more explanatory? She paused. I think it was because I didn't have time to think about it. I just wrote the most essential thing, the irreducible thing. And it worked because the person who saw it was someone who could read what was essential without needing more. Cole thought about that. The 2 seconds at the frosted glass, the word in eyeliner, the immediate understanding of what it meant. Most people would have looked away, he said. But you didn't. No. She was quiet for a moment, then, why do you think that is? The real reason. Not the version about not wanting to be the person who had it right and couldn't act. That's part of it. What's the rest? It was the kind of question that required honesty rather than a good answer, and Cole had learned the difference. He thought about Mia at the drop-off line with her crooked ponytail. He thought about Linda Ostrowski, who never minded the last-minute calls. He thought about Janet Reyes and her gas station coffee, and her 17 years of knowing exactly what she was looking at. He thought about the specific shape of a life built in the years after leaving one kind of service and finding another, without calling it that, without ceremony, just doing what you could do for the people in front of you. I think I needed to know that I still could, he said. Not the physical part, not the walking into a room part, the seeing what mattered part. He paused. You spend enough time feeling like the ground shifted under you, you start to wonder if you can still read the ground. And then someone drops a napkin, and you realize you can. You still can. Victoria walked beside him. The street was quiet enough that you could hear the difference between their footsteps. You could, she said. You can. They walked a little farther. A dog barked somewhere on a side street. A couple passed them going the other direction, speaking in low voices about something that made one of them laugh. Spring moved around them like a presence. My daughter asked me something last week, Cole said. She asked me if the case I'd been working on was finished. I said mostly yes. She said, and I'm quoting exactly, is it the kind of finished where the bad guys got in trouble, or the kind of finished where nothing really happened? He paused. I told her the first kind. She said good, and went back to her homework. That's the right verdict, Victoria said. 9-year-olds usually are. She smiled, and it was the unguarded kind. The one he'd learned to wait for, not because it was withheld, but because it was real, and real things had their own timing. They stood at the corner where they'd need to go in different directions. Her car was parked down one block, his down another. The evening had that particular quality of an Atlanta spring night when it cooperated, which was warm but not heavy, the air just right. Saturday, she said. Mia's game. 11, usually. I'd like to come, she said. It was direct, the way she said everything, with no performance around it. If that's all right? Cole looked at her. He thought about Mia's arm out the car window on the way to school, cutting through the air. He thought about the small apartment that was slightly too large for 2 people and maybe just right for 3 on a Saturday morning. I thought about the way things arrived. Not how you planned them, not as rewards for the right sequence of decisions, but sideways through frosted glass, through a word on a napkin, through a canceled meeting and a corner table and the choice to look at a thing instead of away from it. Yeah, he said. Come. She nodded once, the kind of nod that meant it was settled, the kind that closed a decision rather than opened one. He'd learned to read those too. They said goodnight. They went in their different directions, through the April evening, through the green Atlanta trees, through the ordinary neighborhood with its ordinary sounds and its ordinary people going about the unspectacular business of their lives. Cole drove home. He parked in the garage and sat in the car for a moment before getting out, not because he was avoiding something, but because the moment felt like one worth sitting in. The case was concluded. The record was correct. The machine that had operated for 12 years had been documented, exposed, and stopped by the accumulated weight of evidence and process, and 2 people who had spent a night in an office that smelled like old ink, refusing to stop pulling on threads. What he had done was not heroic in any way that made for a good story. He'd sat at a restaurant, looked through glass, read a word, and made a decision. He'd read documents he was trained to read. He'd called a forensic accountant he already trusted. He'd answered questions clearly in a courtroom. None of it required anything extraordinary. All of it required something that was harder than extraordinary. The steady, sustained choice to do what you were capable of doing, even when the outcome was uncertain, even when the cost was real, even when you were tired and underfunded, and the people on the other side had more resources and more patience than you. He thought about what you passed on to a 9-year-old, and whether it was the things you said or the things you did, and what the difference was. He thought Mia was learning the answer to that question by living beside him, the same way he'd learned things by living beside the people who had shaped him, not through instruction, but through daily proximity to choices being made. He got out of the car. He went upstairs. He checked on Mia, asleep, the boneless sleep, one arm off the bed again, in exactly the same position as always, like her body had a default setting. He picked up the soccer cleats from the floor and put them by the door. He stood in the kitchen in the quiet apartment and thought about Saturday. Victoria in the bleachers at a youth soccer game, watching Mia argue with the referee about a call she found unjust. Janet Reyes sending a comprehensive expense summary for the dinners Cole now owed her, organized by date and itemized. The Chicago case waiting in the file. The spring continuing outside the window. He thought about a napkin on a restaurant table and a word written in the most honest handwriting he'd ever seen. One word. Written fast, written without deliberation, written from the irreducible truth of a moment when everything had been stripped away, and what was left was the essential thing, the only thing, the simple human need for someone to see that you needed help and choose to answer. He had answered. That was all. That was everything. He turned off the kitchen light. He went to bed. Outside, Atlanta moved through its spring night, the city doing what cities did, holding millions of separate lives in motion simultaneously, each one its own complete world, each one occasionally touching another in the way that lives touched when people were paying attention. Cole Bennett was 37 years old. He had a daughter who wanted a cat and had strong opinions about soccer and asked the right questions at the wrong times and was the most important person in his life and knew it because he made sure she knew it. He had work that he was good at, work that mattered in the specific way that mattered to him. Not the scale of it, but the correctness of it, the insistence on seeing clearly and saying what was true. He had a woman who was coming to a soccer game on Saturday, and that was new and uncertain and probably not going to be simple, and those things were not reasons against it. He had his name in a federal record, attached to an investigation that had been correct, that had always been correct, that had finally been confirmed as correct in the only venue that put it beyond argument. He had been patient for 6 years without knowing he was being patient. He had waited without knowing he was waiting. And when the moment arrived, disguised as a canceled meeting and a corner table and a Tuesday evening with nothing particular planned, he had been ready for it, because readiness wasn't something you built at the last minute. It was something you maintained day after day through the ordinary choices and the steady work and the refusal to stop being who you were, even when who you were had cost you something. That was the thing, he thought, in the quiet before sleep. That was what he'd tell Mia if she ever asked him, in whatever form the question eventually took. Not the lesson about justice, not the lesson about patience, not even the lesson about doing the right thing when it was easier not to. Just this: stay ready. Stay honest about what you can see. And when someone asks for help, even in the smallest possible language, even in a single word written on a napkin no bigger than your hand, be the kind of person who doesn't look away. Everything else followed from that.